Welcome to Bio 102, Humans and the Environment. Unit 1 is going to deal with environmental science. We're going to talk about some of the basics of environmental thinking, environmental worldviews, environmental activist philosophies, as well as the basics of science. What is the scientific method? Some of you have had science courses before. You'll be familiar with the basic outlines of the scientific method. Once we get through the basic step-by-step process, I'll give you some examples of how we apply the scientific method specifically in environmental science, because there are actually some differences. A lot of sciences, you spend most of your time in a laboratory doing very, very controlled tests. But in environmental science, we're talking about ecosystems. These are not controlled environments. So a lot of our experiments have to be field experiments out in nature, or observational experiments where we just go out and we record data and then we have to interpret from that. So we get much more varied results than you might get from, say, a test tube type experiment. We'll also look at what the components of an ecosystem are. Every ecosystem is going to have different things in it, obviously. A desert doesn't have the same types of plants and animals in it that a deciduous forest like you would find in Pennsylvania would have. Not only does it not have the same plants and animals and living things, what we would refer to as the biotic components, the living components, bios, life, but they don't have the same non-living components either. Non-living components of an ecosystem would be things like the temperature, the frequency of precipitation that's related to the amount of water, the quality of the soil, how much nitrogen is in the soil, how much phosphorus is in the soil, things along those lines. So different types of non-living factors will influence what types of organisms will live in that ecosystem. And a combination of those factors will tell you what kind of ecosystem you actually have. Is it a desert? Is it a deciduous forest? Is it a shrubland? Is it a grassland? What kind of ecosystem do we have? So we'll look at that. Now, to start out with, your book talks about different environmental worldviews and different environmental activist type philosophies. So we'll talk a little bit about this as well. And the environmentalist movement in the United States, it really got kicked up into full gear in the 1970s. But the very beginnings of it started a little bit earlier than that. Once we started to realize a single fact that honestly it took humans an embarrassingly long time to actually accept, and that was that natural resources can run out. We didn't think it was possible for species to go extinct as late as the 17 and 1800s. It was like leading scientists didn't think that humans could deplete a natural resource fast enough for it to just disappear. We didn't think you could hunt something to extinction. We didn't think you could use up a forest. We didn't think we could just do it. But as more and more examples piled up, it became a pretty inescapable conclusion that in fact you can use natural resources faster than they can be replenished. What that means is you could cut down trees in a forest faster than the forest can grow back, and eventually you could cut down the entire forest. In reaction to this realization that natural resources can be used up, two schools of thought emerge. We have the Conservationist School and the Preservationist School. And that's what this photo is sort of meant to represent. We have Teddy Roosevelt, which I hope you recognized on the left here, former President of the United States, and he very much is a representative of the Conservationist School of thinking. To his side here, the gentleman with the impressive beard, his name is John Moyer. John Moyer is the founder of the Sierra Club, which is still an environmental activist organization that is involved in preservation of natural lands today, and he is the founder of the Preservationist School of thinking. So in order to explain the difference between these two ideas, conservationist is to conserve the resources, but you can still utilize the resources. A conservationist approach would say that the purpose of these natural resources, at least in this philosophical framework, is for human economies to benefit from or for humans to use. But we do not want to use them at such a rate that we would eventually use them all up and they would disappear. So how do you deal with that? You use them sustainably. So using that forest example, you can cut down the trees, but you cut them down at the same rate at which the forest can regrow the trees, so that every tree you cut down, the next year there's another tree that's reaching maturity at the exact same time, So the net number of trees every year is going to be the same. Not only are you cutting down the same number of trees that are being replaced every year so that there's no change, but you can also selectively choose the trees that are the oldest, the ones that are the most vulnerable to disease, the ones that are blocking light for other trees to be able to utilize. You can selectively manage the forest in a clever way that allows it to flourish and be the most productive it possibly can be, so that you can continue to utilize that resource forever into the future. So this is the idea that we actually use with paper farms, where we grow trees specifically for making paper. This is what we use in a lot of fisheries, where we produce fish, but we make sure that there are some remaining to continue making the new population every year as we extract some from the fishery to be used for meat. This is the logic behind issuing hunting licenses and hunting limits per year, saying, okay, you can only hunt this many deer this particular year because this is what the population is. If the population goes up, then we loosen those restrictions, but if it's really low, then we limit the number of hunting licenses that are issued. It's all a conservationist mindset. The Preservationist School of Thought says that these natural resources are valuable in their own right. They have intrinsic value, which is entirely separate from their value to human economies or to humans for their usage. They're not intended for human usage. Yes, they are useful, but that's not their philosophical purpose. They should be left alone to exist because they are wonderful, and that's all they need to be. So the preservationist mindset is what causes us to set up things like large national preserves, like big parks. John Moyer was one of the people who really pushed for Yosemite National Park to be established, where you have these very, very, very large tracts of land which are essentially untouched natural environments. You can go and you can actually appreciate what the ecosystem of that area looked like before any kind of human interaction. And when you go there, you do understand, like, there is value in this that is quite separate from the cost of the materials you could get out of it, or the cost of the meat you could get out of it, or the price of the land that could be sold to developers. Just having these natural areas is valuable in and of itself. It has cultural value, it has recreational value, it provides places for a diversity of species that maybe we're not currently using for any kind of manufacturing process, any kind of meat production or wood production or any other kind of product, but it's a place where they can continue to live. So we get a large diversity, and we call that biodiversity, the number of different species, the number of different kinds of organisms you have in an area in these large national preserves as a result of this preservationist mindset. Without it, we would undoubtedly have lost a lot more species over time. As an example, imagine bald eagles were about to go extinct. We don't get any products from bald eagles. We don't eat them for meat. We don't really use their feathers for anything. We don't get medications from them. But if bald eagles were about to go extinct, we would be very upset about that fact. We would do anything to preserve their species. We would go to great lengths to make sure that some bald eagles continue to remain in the United States simply because the fact that they exist makes us happy. There's something important about them. They are the symbol of America. And that is true of a lot of different species. A lot of species we consider to just be valuable by existing, even regardless of what kind of financial value they might have to our economies. And that thing about the bald eagles, that did happen in the 1970s. We'll talk about that a little bit later on when we start talking about endangered species. And it did catalyze people in the United States to take action. It wasn't just bald eagles, it was lots of other large predatory birds at the same time. Now, lest you think that the Preservationist School is the only one associated with setting up preserves, I should point out that Teddy Roosevelt, who I'm using as my conservationist here, doubled the size of the national park system during his time in office. He added 36 national parks. And I also don't want you to think that I'm presenting these two ideas to you as something that you need to choose between to decide which one you think is better. There are going to be problems, environmental problems, that I present to you throughout the semester, and you might think, a conservationist mindset might be the way to solve this issue. We should be able to get some resources out of that because we need them, but there should be a sustainable way to do it. Or you might think, hey, you know what? A preservationist mindset is the way to go about this. That area should be left completely alone because it is valuable just by existing the way it is. And the profit we would get from it is negligible compared to its intrinsic value as a plot of land. And of course, a lot of the problems that we might look at will be more complicated than the ones I've mentioned here. For example, when I was talking about the bald eagle, I mentioned that we don't get any products directly from that eagle, but I didn't mention that it has a role in its ecosystem as an apex predator, keeping the populations of other animals in check in that area. So if the bald eagles disappeared, the entire ecosystem in that area may have been thrown out of whack, which may have affected one of the other organisms that we do get products from. In this class, we're going to discuss a number of environmental problems, and we're also going to look at some of the legislation that's on the book at the national, state, and local level meant to mitigate some of those problems. A lot of these are regulations, and regulations are just rules that companies have to follow. Sometimes regulations get kind of a bad rep. It's almost, people say it like it has a negative connotation to it. But like I said, these are rules that companies need to follow. Without regulations, they are permitted to do essentially whatever they like. And this story is a really good example of what happens if you have no regulations, because prior to the 1960s, we didn't really have a lot of national regulations on the books saying what companies could and could not do with their industrial waste. In Cleveland, Ohio, there was a lot of manufacturing facilities. They had really built up manufacturing industry, particularly creating a lot of petroleum products, which create a lot of excess petroleum waste. And what are they going to do with this waste? Well, there's no regulation, so they just dumped it directly into the Cuyahoga River. The Cuyahoga River, taking in all this petroleum waste, got this nice oily sheen over the top of it, that kind of rainbow swirly look that oil on water tends to have. And of course that generated kind of smell, and it killed all of the fish and the plants and all the other aquatic life that lived in that river, and having lots of dead, rotting matter inside the river, that didn't help the smell much either. So we had this very, very filthy, very, very smelly river flowing through Cleveland. But although it was seen as a problem, it was also kind of seen as, well, hey, that is a result of all of our industry. It's a result of our prosperity. So, a dirty river, that's kind of a sign that we are doing really well. So the problem was ignored a little bit until the river caught on fire. There was enough petroleum inside that river for the river to catch on fire. And then all of the homes and businesses, the bridges over the river, everything that was adjacent to that river took a lot of fire damage as a result. So real property damage, massive amounts of property damage occurred because of the lack of environmental regulation preventing these companies to put any petroleum products in this river. And people said, hey, this is a huge problem. We need to put some sort of limitation on this kind of behavior. And they thought about it, and they didn't do it until the river caught on fire 12 more times. So after the 12th or 13th time that the river caught on fire, they eventually passed some regulations, and this also then led to Congress passing the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA, which was the forerunner to helping establish the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the main regulatory agency at the federal level to make sure that companies and individuals within the United States are obeying environmental regulations such as the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which prevents exactly this type of behavior. The Cuyahoga River fire caused millions of dollars in property damage before it was fixed, and this leads to a phrase that you're probably going to hear me say a number of times during this course, which is that environmental problems are economic problems. And in the long run, ignoring them is often more expensive than fixing them. On the topic of environmental problems, your textbook provides a number of root causes of environmental problems, which are a little bit more abstract, and what they actually are themes of your textbook, things that it goes back to over and over and over again. So since they're going to be mentioned several times throughout your readings, I think we should probably go through a few of them now and talk about what they are. The first one being unsustainable resource use. I've already mentioned this notion a little bit. Unsustainable resource use is when you remove some resource from the environment faster than the environment can replace it. So in this picture, we have two men who are standing in front of a very strange looking hill. And if you look very closely, you can see that this hill is actually made of buffalo skulls. This is thousands and thousands and thousands of buffalo skulls, each one from a kill that they had had. The American buffalo being a species that we almost hunted completely into extinction, going from populations in the millions down to just a couple of hundred. Today they exist in national wildlife preserves. The concept of overharvesting or unsustainable resource use is not limited to hunting animals, though. You could use the same logic to think about cutting down lumber and regrowing a forest, an example I already used. Or you could consider something like removing groundwater from a well faster than the natural rate of recharge of rainwater percolating through the soil and refilling that underground aquifer. If you remove water faster than it can be replaced, eventually you can pump a well dry. Another example might be the exotic pet species trade, where people will go to parrot nests in the rainforest and they will remove the eggs and then they will sell the little baby parrots to exotic pet traders. And that means that there are fewer new parrots arriving to replace the older breeding pairs that are dying off. So overall, the rate of reproduction is declining, and slowly but surely the population begins to shrink. Or you could think about the use of non-renewable resources. Those are resources that no matter how long you wait, you're never getting more of it. For all intents and purposes, the amount of coal that exists on Earth today, that's all the coal we're ever going to be able to use. It takes tens of millions of years to get new coal. As far as human societies are concerned, what we have is what we got. So any amount of coal usage is eventually going to deplete the amount of reserves that we currently have left. And therefore, that energy source is fundamentally unsustainable. That is a topic we'll talk about more when we get into different methods of energy production. Another root cause of environmental problems that your book mentions is affluence, the state of having abundant resources or an abundance of money, like you would see in highly developed countries like the United States. This photo shows some produce that looks perfectly edible being placed into a dump. Frequently, what happens is when grocery stores do not sell all their produce, it goes, an extra day over what they consider to be perfectly fresh, they just end up throwing it out. And the same goes for us when we don't eat everything in our fridge. We, buy as much as we can in terms of resources, but things, I'm not sure if this is good past sell-by day, we toss stuff out. We go to a restaurant, we don't eat everything on our plate. When farmers are growing food, they only send the food that looks cosmetically the best, like people would want to buy it over, and some of it is just left on the ground to rot, or it's itself shipped off or composted somewhere else, or sent to a landfill. In total, about 40% of the food we grow in the United States gets thrown away and is not eaten by anyone. And that's in a country where millions of families are suffering from food insecurity. But even if we could get food to all the people that need food in the United States, we still make way more food than we actually eat. Our country's relative affluence has allowed us to create an excess amount of food, an excess amount of products, and then take the stuff that we don't want and discard it. And a lot of that food waste ends up in landfills, as I said, which then ends up rotting and creating methane, which then has its own problems associated with it. We'll talk about climate change and the atmosphere later on. Affluence can be a root cause of environmental problems because having an abundance of resources or having an abundance of money can allow you to consume more resources than you require to survive or even require to thrive. And creating lots of excess products also creates lots of excess waste, like the petroleum waste that I mentioned on the Cuyahoga River or any other emissions from factories or landfills. So taking these vegetables as an example, not only is it just a waste of food, but also think about all of the water that was used in order to grow these vegetables. It's a waste of water. Think about all of the gas that was used to transport the vegetables from the farm to the grocery store, from the grocery store to the landfill. Think of the space that farm occupies. that was needed in order to grow these extra vegetables, the fertilizers and the topsoil that went into growing them, a lot of resources end up going into ultimately unnecessary products. Then the next root cause of environmental problems the book offers is poverty. So it has affluence on one hand, having an abundance of money, and then poverty on the other hand, having no money whatsoever. So if affluence can be a root cause of environmental problems, how can poverty be a root cause of environmental problems? And the reason is that when you do not have money, you do not have choice. Money is power, right? That's what they say. Well, power is the ability to make choices. It's the ability to make decisions. And if you don't have a lot of money, maybe the most environmentally damaging option is the only one available to you. So this woman here is, she's been over and she's making what are called uklas, which are cow patties, essentially. It's used as a method of creating cooking fuel. They're going to burn these in order to create cooking fuel for fires. And it's one of the only energy sources that they really have. It's the only thing they can really burn right around there, and you can see that they've prepared quite a few of them because that's what they're working with. There is a population in India roughly equivalent to the entire population of the United States, which does not have electricity. In order to provide it to them, you would need to create energy processing facilities, so some sort of power plant in order to create that energy and get that infrastructure to the villages and rural areas where they don't have any electricity currently. So imagine that you're in charge of this decision. You're trying to figure out what kind of power plant you're going to create. You could create a nuclear power plant, very expensive. You could create an alternative energy plant if you can find the right location for a solar farm or a wind farm or geothermal, but that, might be a little bit fussy, and maybe this new technology isn't as reliable. After all, wealthy countries like the United States haven't fully invested in them, and they have a lot more financial leeway than you do in order to make this decision. Or would you take a look at the far cheaper option and remember that India has one of the largest coal deposits in the entire world? And even if you know that coal is the most polluting form of energy production, you also know that there are millions of citizens that do not currently have any electricity at all, and they need energy that is cheap and reliable. And leaving them without electricity is simply not an option. That is the way in which poverty can be a root cause of environmental problems. You might not be capable of making the more environmentally conscious choice. The next root cause of environmental problems that the book cites is population growth, and this makes sense. If humans are responsible for a lot of environmental problems, it stands to reason that the more humans that there are, the more environmental problems or the more prevalent the environmental problems that we cause will become. And indeed, since the Industrial Revolution, the human population has skyrocketed, growing at an exponential rate over the past couple hundred years. There are several underlying causes of that population growth. Number one, we have been able to decrease our mortality rate. Vaccines have lowered the incidence of death, particularly infant mortality rates. Modern medical techniques, our understanding of medicine has improved. We have new medications. We have imaging technology and anesthetics that allow us to survive surgeries. We can live much longer into our full adult lifespans. We have also converted a large portion of the Earth's surface over to tillable land for agricultural production, so we have been able to produce more and more and more food, which increases the total number of humans that the Earth could possibly sustain, what's called the carrying capacity, the total number of organisms of a given species that one area can possibly have. So we've raised the Earth's carrying capacity for humans. Now, doubling the human population doesn't mean that environmental problems become twice as bad, because the areas where population growth is actually the highest are the places that have the least affluence and therefore consume the least goods per capita, the fewest resources per person. The resource consumption of the average person in a highly developed country could be 20 or 30 times higher than that of a person in a less developed country. And that's why doubling the population wouldn't necessarily double the environmental impact of humans on the environment. Relative resource consumption also needs to be considered when thinking about population growth. We're going to talk at length about population growth and specifically human population growth later on in the semester, so I'm going to leave that where it is for right now and move on to the next root cause of environmental problems that your book cites, which is a lack of full cost pricing, or the way it puts it is excluding environmental costs. As American citizens, we pay taxes. So we pay our money to the government. We're good citizens. We pay our taxes. Every year it comes out of our paychecks. Some of that tax money is going to go into infrastructure, into funding government programs, into funding government projects, but some of it is going to go into subsidies paid out to certain industries, and some of it is going to be used to decrease the tax rate of other types of industries, so tax breaks and subsidies. When an industry is the recipient of such financial favor, it artificially decreases the price of their products. If there were some product that we wanted to incentivize people to buy that was perhaps a net good for humans, a net good for society, say we want to incentivize them to buy alternatives because it's less polluting to the atmosphere, then it would make sense to create government subsidies and tax breaks for those alternative energy sources. However, a lot of government subsidies and tax breaks go to already environmentally polluting industries, like the oil and gas industry. Effectively, this means that the price per gallon of oil that you see at the pump is not the true price of that gas, because you also paid your taxes and some small portion of your tax money went to artificially reducing the price of the gallon. So you've paid twice. Add on to that emissions from these products are exacerbating factors like climate change, another topic that we'll talk about later on this semester, that unburnt particulates from any kind of combustion reaction end up suspended in the air, and then they can be breathed in, and this increases incidence of asthma and bronchitis and emphysema and lung cancer, which leads to higher medical bills, higher insurance rates, which means we're paying real-world costs, actual dollars coming out of our pockets as a result of these industries, and they're not paying the additional cost, we are. Consider the land, which would have been open for public use, but now could be strip mined away in order to get seams of coal out of the land. Gone are the days of coal mining. We just completely strip away mountainsides in order to get it. Or create oil fields, which poison the entire landscape. And then from the land could also end up polluting waterways, which means we would have to invest more money in infrastructure for increased water purification. So there are real costs in terms of medical bills, in terms of pollution control, in terms of mitigation for future climate change, in terms of lost biodiversity, in terms of lost ecosystem services, none of which are really being factored into the actual cost of the gallon of gas. So if you could imagine a hypothetical system wherein we reduce everyone's payroll tax rate, but we institute something called a carbon tax, where the amount of pollution a product represents is factored into its actual price. According to the calculations that the economists did that helped with the textbook, they calculate that a gallon of gas might cost about $12 a gallon. With that kind of figure in mind, suddenly the push to develop electric cars or more efficient cars or alternate technologies suddenly would become a lot more urgent. This is what your book means by full cost pricing, incorporating environmental and health costs into the price of polluting products, the goal being to allow consumers to make informed choices about the products they use based on the price per product, rather than putting the responsibility for researching all of the environmental impacts of every single product that you use on every single individual consumer, and having to decide between being environmentally conscious and frugal. Now, different economists will disagree about what the actual number will be. This says $12 per gallon, and this number isn't pulled out of nowhere. This is an earnest attempt to calculate what the total cost per gallon would be if all the subsidies and tax breaks were removed and certain environmental and medical costs were factored in. That number could be slightly higher or lower, but one thing is certain: the price that we currently pay for a lot of products is artificially cheapened, and therefore they are not competing in a fair, free market. The last root cause of environmental problems that the book cites is increasing isolation from nature. As the human population has grown, most of that growth has occurred in cities. More than half the human population now lives in artificial urban environments as opposed to more rural environments closer to natural ecosystems. When I speak about a forest for an increasing number of people, that's something that you would have to drive a substantial distance in order to go visit. It's something that occurs over there. It's outside of your immediate experience. And so it becomes very easy to conceptualize the environment as something separate from human affairs, especially when the most prevalent examples of environmental damage that you see are the Amazon rainforest or coral reefs, things that are very, very distant away from us. But when I speak about air pollution, I'm talking about the air that we are currently breathing, the air that is filling your lungs right now as you listen to this video. When I say the loss of a wetland or a forest affects the water purification services downstream, I'm talking about the water that we are currently drinking. When I talk about the relative value of the biodiversity of a wildlife preserve versus the oil that maybe sits under that wildlife preserve that we could use for financial gain, I'm talking about actual decisions that our economists and politicians are making every day. Even if you've never set foot in certain natural habitats, you might be connected to them in ways you didn't expect. But it is still difficult to feel passionately about protecting a place that you have never actually been or do not spend a lot of time in. And so I would encourage anyone taking this class throughout the semester, if you have an opportunity to go to a park, to visit an orchard, to go camping, to go visit some natural environment, that you take it and look around and maybe bring a tree identification book or a plant identification book or a bird identification book and, become familiar with some of the organisms that live in our state, that live in our immediate area, or if you're going traveling around, maybe they live in other locations. What this will do is take sometimes abstract discussions about, quote, the environment, and make them a little bit more concrete. We're talking about something that you've experienced.